Yeah, my name is Sergei Zhuk, and I started my new project. An introduction to this project is this new book called The KGB, Russian Academic Imperialism, Ukraine, and Western Academia, 1946, 2024. But this is just beginning. It's introduction of my new project. I decided to write this project during my sabbatical. It's my sabbatical leave. And Woodrow Wilson Center, International Center for Scholars, awarded me a very good, prestigious grant, fellowship for 1 year to finish this project. And I decided to write, a bigger book, because this is just introduction and sketch of my major themes. And my major themes is influence of Soviet and Russian intelligence, not just in politics, but in academia, in think tanks, in Slavic centers, Soviet centers in the West, especially in the United States, in Canada and UK. And two special intelligence agencies are more important in this case. Is the first, forgotten now, but very active, Главное разведывательное управление, its main military intelligence agency, which was founded immediately after the revolution, October Revolution, in 1918, and Bolsheviks sent their agents who represented this agency in Western Europe, in United States, and they were the most active and the most dangerous and the most efficient representatives of Soviet regime. The second agency, which was part of traditional ВЧК, НКВД, Народный комиссариат внутренних дел, and was called Комитет государственной безопасности, was part of this structure, was protecting Soviet revolution, Soviet regime. And after 1946, it became known as KGB after institutionalization of this agency in the 50s under Khrushchev. But sometimes our scholars in the West forgot that KGB was just part of this picture, and probably the most efficient and the most dangerous was the first one, GRU. And that's why in my book, I started with the most scandalous case when not KGB, but GRU agent with name of Zalman Litvin, who penetrated United States through Canada, by the way, and through England. And then he became student of University of Southern California. He organized a cell of Soviet sympathizers in the 40s during World War II, because Soviet Union was, as you remember, was ally of United States in the war against Nazis. And he actually became very active first student and then teacher, professor. And it was the most scandalous case when then more than 100 American citizens became agents of his organization. And this organization was not KGB. It was this military intelligence agency from the Soviet Union known as GRU, Главное разведывательное управление. He used these sympathies and left intentions of those students. Probably you remember from literature that in the West, including the United Kingdom especially, in Canada and in United States, during the World War II, we had this spread of communist interests and communist influences. As you remember, even people who worked for MI6, MI5 in Britain became recruited by KGB, and these people were very famous figures in British intelligence who, but again, they were sympathizers. They wanted this new model socialist system spread all over the world. They had this idealized vision of the Soviet Union, forgetting about the Holodomor, about all these atrocities. And many of them didn't knew about what happened inside of the Soviet Union under Stalin. The same happened in California. Litvin, whose name, remember I sent you a picture of he had his GRU pseudonym Mulat. Litvin recruited these people using their emphasis for socialism, and he actually was very active. But in Canada during this time, his supervisor, Soviet agent Kravchenko, actually changed sides, and he began working with CIA and with MI6, and he sent this list of Soviet agents in both Canada and United States in 1945. It was actually the first case of so-called Cold War in intelligence, when the KGB grew on Soviet side and CIA and MI6 on Western side clashed. It was beginning of real Cold War in intelligence service. So they decided to start with this case. And in my future book, I will have entire chapter about this guy. Litvin is very talented intelligence officer who did this tremendous and very dangerous work inside of American academia in very prestigious college, University of Southern California. He eventually managed to flee to Canada from United States, and Soviet agents moved him to Soviet Union. Then they moved his family from United States to Soviet Union. So he ended his career teaching in prestigious Soviet universities. He worked for very, very important, very influential KGB-centered think tank in Soviet Union known as ИМГИМО, Институт международной экономики и международных отношений, Institute of International Relations and International Economy. He lived until 90s, and he was, well, it was very interesting life story, and I will begin my next book with this story. I mentioned this in my book, KGB, Russian Academic Imperialism. Why? Because people like Litvin, and I mentioned other names of Soviet agents in 40s, actually promoted this ideal of great Russian Empire, great Soviet Union, and this narrative, this image of very positive image of Soviet culture and Soviet history centered on Russian historiography, ignoring non-Russian nationalities of Soviet Union, of course, became prevalent in entire Western academia, including British academia, including American academia. And that's why I decided to put this story in my book, which we discussed today, because Litvin is a typical example how this idealized pro-Soviet, pro-Russian version of history was imposed on American students. And millions of American students in American colleges, British students, Canadian students actually followed this so-called Russian academic imperialism, even not thinking about the roots and danger of this narrative in our educational system. Yes, unfortunately, this model of Russian-centered, Moscow-centered story of Russian Empire and Soviet Union prevailed even in centers of very important centers of Slavic studies, such as Columbia University, Harvard, and this unfortunately influence perception of those people who took these classes, including future CIA and FBI agents. And as a result, many of these people, let me put this. As a result, these people ignored non-Russian stories in this narrative. And moreover, through this narrative, KGB and GRU tried to impose this positive picture of Soviet Union. And unfortunately, especially during Perestroika and before, when we had this exchange of scholars between Soviet Union and the United States, it started in 1958. Again, agents, real officers of KGB and GRU prevailed. I remember I sent you a picture of the first group of people who participated in exchange with Columbia. And as you remember, I mentioned that these 4 students, original Soviet Americanists, who arrived in Columbia, represented Soviet Secret Service. 3 of them were, one of them was Yakovlev, future consultant, future mastermind of Perestroika and ambassador in Canada. But other 3 in this group were officers. 2 of them, including Oleg Kalugin, future general of KGB, were officers of KGB, and one Stozhkov on this picture was officer of GRU. So can you imagine the first group of exchange students represent major Soviet intelligence? And this trend continued. Next visit to Columbia, who became a student of Richard Hofstadter, famous American, very conservative professor, was another agent of KGB, young, ambitious scholar from Moscow State University, Nikolai Sivachov, who was a favorite Soviet scholar by all, for all American colleagues. They loved his humor. They loved his accent. He became a friend of Franklin Delano Roosevelt family, and he wrote actually a very good book about New Deal in the United States and politics of Roosevelt. But problem was that this guy was KGB agent. He was sent not just as ordinary scholar, but as KGB spy. And KGB used these guys like Sivachov not just to collect information, but more important, to influence people, establish infrastructure of connections. And this was effective for these pro-Soviet interests and pro-Soviet sympathies among American students who met Sivachov, who became famous American Sovietologists, who went to Soviet Union. So this was very interesting beginning in 50s and 60s of these connections between Soviet Americanists, majority of them were KGB or GRU agents, and Sovietologists, especially in the United States, and then in Canada, and then in the United Kingdom. So they created this entire infrastructure of these connections. So Soviet Americans invited American Sovietologists to Moscow, to Leningrad, to Kiev, and American Sovietologists invited Soviet, including Russian and Ukrainian specialists, Americanists into the United States. Many of them, including people from Ukraine, like I devote an entire chapter to Ukrainian KGB connection, like Arnold Shlepakov, were agents of KGB and unfortunately, its influence also American diaspora. Shlepakov stayed in Toronto, in other places in Canada. He became friend with Peter Kravchuk, famous, Canadian communist, with other people from Ukraine diaspora. And you need to remember that majority of Canadian left were Ukrainian communists. This is another problem. So we now ignore, KGB represented for official propaganda all Ukraine diaspora as, Banderovites, fascists, but we know that it's not true. Majority of Ukrainian diaspora were very left, and they were used and abused by KGB and GRU in both Canada and United States. And the final example, I also sent a picture of Lev Slezkine, a famous professor from University of California, Berkeley, who represented crème à la crème of Soviet elite. His father and his mother represented this Jewish Russian Communist International, so to speak. And Slezkine was hired as military translator, военный переводчик, or военный перекладач in Ukrainian, by GRU to work in Mozambique. You remember Mozambique and Angola were former Portuguese colonies, were targeted by Soviet intelligence because of the revolution in Portugal, because of colonial anti-colonial wars in these African nations. And Lev and this guy Slezkine was hired by GRU to be intelligence officer. Eventually, he migrated to Portugal in '83, and where he finished, he found support from Sheila Fitzpatrick, who was very leftist, very good professor of Soviet and Russian studies in Texas. Slezkine defended his American dissertation, being Portuguese specialist from Soviet Union. And then eventually in 1992, and I wrote his biography in my book, he found job at University of California, Berkeley. Can you imagine how many people began their studies under his influence? You can just imagine. It's very prestigious, very good center of Slavic studies. And what happened next when Putin attacked Ukraine during the Second War in 2022? Because I still think that he began his war in 2014. It was the first war. He retired, immediately went back to his motherland, to post-Soviet Russia, and he began blaming the West in triggering this war, openly criticizing America and the West. Can you imagine? Guy, many years worked in University of California, Berkeley. So FBI should know that if you worked as military interpreter in Mozambique for Soviet GRU, you should be very careful with it. No, they gave him job, and now he criticized the United States openly, living in Moscow, coming back in Moscow, and continue on and on and on how American actually institutions and think tank made very serious and dangerous mistakes. Another example of Trenin, who was retired colonel of GRU. You remember, it's a very dangerous intelligence agency, who became a leader of Carnegie Foundation in Moscow. And people who hired him, I mean Carnegie Foundation from New York, of course, knew his resume. They knew that he was, Dmitry Trenin was colonel of Soviet agency, intelligence agency GRU. Of course, eventually, because of the Second War, Carnegie Foundation cut relation with him. But from Perestroika until 2022, this guy, who was open supporter of Putin and Putin revanchist politics, which started from 2007, remember his Munich speech, this guy was representative of Carnegie Foundation in post-Soviet Russia. He traveled back and forth. He made, I discovered, he made a few speeches here at Wilson Center and everywhere. And this guy, remember, colonel of Главное разведывательное управление. So, and I can continue on, and I put these pictures in my book. And this dangerous picture, because people forgot that Russian academic imperialism is not a joke. It still exists. And despite all changes, all attempts to introduce so-called decolonizing model and so on, but still these people who are students of Slezkine and Fitzpatrick and others still teaches in very good schools, in Harvard, in Stanford, everywhere. And their students produce new students who still influenced by this Russian academic historiographic model. And this is a very dangerous trend. That's why I put these stories in my book. And it's not just Soviet studies, it's also Ukrainian studies, because many of the people who went to Canada, to Britain and Ukraine from into United States, were connected. If they represent Soviet ruling elite, they represented elite connection to intelligence service. And I wrote the story of Ivan Katchanovski, for example, who was supported by American Ukrainian diaspora in Canada, who actually graduated from very good school, George Mason University here. I'm now in DC, it's not far from here. And he went to Canada. Frankly speaking, I was surprised because he represents very Ukrainian-speaking area of Soviet Ukraine, Lutsk, Volyn, you know this. And he was very active as a student in Ruch movement, but suddenly something cracked. I don't know what happened with his mental perception of the world. But he began blaming Ukraine for this rise of neo-Nazi, and his publications, especially comments on Maidan Revolution, began used by Russian intelligence. I don't imply that he is KGB agent, of course not. But KGB used so-called useful assets or useful idiots. As we used to joke about these useful idiots in American academia. And unfortunately, this guy from Volyn, from Lutsk, Ivan Katchanovski, who originally was supported by Ukrainian Ramada community, became actually a very useful tool in the hands of Russian intelligence in this anti-Ukrainian propaganda. Another case, I already mentioned the book, it's a very shameful case when without any checking, Ukrainian Gramada helped career of Tarik Amar. It's Turkic-born German specialist in Soviet history, who was a student of Stephen Kotkin in Princeton, who took very pro-Putin and very anti-Ukrainian. I told my Ukrainian friends, "What you're doing?" They, supported his career. He became established scholar at Columbia. And in Columbia, I had my very good friend, Eric Foneritz, Jewish-American specialist in Abraham Lincoln, Civil War. And, you remember, I'm Americanist. I'm still Americanist. And my book is part of this, Soviet-American, Russian-American, Ukrainian-American relation. And I told Eric, look, you have this, Amar, anti-Ukrainian guy. You need to help us. And actually, it's not Ukrainian grammar, but my Americanists help us to remove this guy from Columbia. But it's another example how you should be very careful with people whom you hire or whom support. I know that Ukrainian Armada doesn't like my criticism, but frankly speaking, I was shocked by their choice. And eventually, what Tarik is doing now? He working for Sputnik, for Russia Today television, it's RT. It's openly supported, openly KGB, FSB and GRU supported venues. And he's now doing all these very anti-Ukrainian interviews. Yeah, I would recommend to use common sense, not witch hunt. And I also came from a Soviet background. I was very, as you remember, was very Soviet patriot before Chernobyl affected my health, and when I became anti-Soviet. So I completely understand this, that many of these guys came from these background connections. But unfortunately, in this situation of Cold War revised, and especially with the situation when my mother, my Ukraine is attacked, I don't like bullies, and I would recommend only one thing: use common sense and ask these people question: do you support Putin or not? Because many of these people who now keep silent, I already mentioned in my book, 85% of these immigrants who teach Soviet and Russian and Ukrainian history in U.S. and Canada came from Moscow, or from elites connected to KGB and GRU. But again, we can't, make this purges for everybody. These unliberal measures could backfire, like in recent elections in the United States. Well, I'm a Democrat, and our Democratic Party used unliberal measures to proceed liberal goals and backfired. People began voting against us. The same with this witch hunt in academia. I would recommend to use common sense and ask just historiographic questions, because question about Putin is not just politics, it's also historiography. If you accept Putin vision of the world, you accept Russian academic imperialism in American academia. It's a shame. To decolonize this, you need to add other narratives, Ukrainian, Kazakh, Turkey, whatever. Otherwise, we will have problems with teaching. They afraid to criticize openly Putin and Russian regime, but they're afraid also to support so-called anti-Russian narratives, Rushevsky or Georgian anti-Russian narratives, and unfortunately, plenty of them. They worked in the Houston, University of Houston, Austin, University of Southern Carolina, and continue on and on. I put some of those names in my book. I don't want to spread this information because it would look like beginning of a witch hunt. But believe me, all these guys suppress any spreading of this counter Russian narrative, like Grushevsky, history of Rus, Ukraine. And I don't know how can we deal with this. Probably my criticism is not enough. But at least I gave to administrators of American and Canadian school my advice. Check background of people whom you hired. If people worked in special position, like, for example, военный переводчик, военный перекладач, interpreter for GRU or KGB, it should be a red flag for promoting their career. If they were, for example, still were in Soviet and in post-Soviet time, in position of so-called проректор по работе с иностранцами, dean for working with foreigners. This is KGB nomenclatura. This is KGB position. Check their background. Of course, they could cut these relations, but we have this saying, KGB is always KGB. But anyway, people who hire for administrators can use my book and my suggestions, because I interviews KGB officers who became patriots of Ukraine. Many of them suffered because of Chernobyl, and they took very different anti-Kremlin positions, including myself. I hate that. After Chernobyl, I can't accept this Kremlin and Russian domination. So I asked them about the major signs or red flags in biography, and they told me, well, just look how these guys. And unfortunately, Americans still make these mistakes. The recent example, for example, it's young Americanist Ivan Kurila, who actually was very silent during the war against Ukraine, living in St. Petersburg. But then he fled. Now he accepted to work in United States. But check his biography. He worked as проректор по работе с иностранцами, dean. So this is KGB nomenclatura. Nomenclatura, it means official position with KGB clearance. And another example of connections. Also, American, Canadian, and British administrators should check this. All KGB, well, now SBU officers mention the fact that if you worked for Ruski Mir Foundation or for Valdai Discussion Club, it should be a red flag for your connection and sympathies for Soviet intelligence. Because Ruski Mir Foundation is a cover organization led by KGB officer Nikonov, who is son of KGB officer, by the way. And just check biography of American, Canadian, and British Sovietologists. And you'll be shocked how many of them, I mean, either Russians, Russian emigres, or American, British, or Canadian citizens are related to Ruski Mir Foundation or so-called experts in Valdai Discussion Club. 70%, 75%. In the English-speaking nation, because I didn't check Germany, I didn't check France, I didn't check Switzerland, I didn't check Italy, I didn't check Spain. I just check United States, only English-speaking nations. I didn't check Australia. Three countries: United States, Canada, and United Kingdom. Now I'm working with a list of scholars who worked in Canon, in Wilson Center. People from Wilson Center can help me with, it's published. I have these books in Canada. I work. Unfortunately, some of them, especially those who visit center before collapse of Soviet Union, of course, were connected to Soviet. And I have this list, and then I analyze them, and then I check their biography on websites. You don't need to go to FBI archives in College Park, National Archives in the United States, because they have everything documented, but they have limitations on opening these archives. So you can find something for 50s and 60s, but nothing for 70s. I was very disappointed. Don't go to Department of State files or FBI files. They all this classified everything. But instead of going to archives, use open sources. So I started with this Canon Institute list and connect this with biography of these people after collapse of the Soviet Union, how many of them found job in the West. And then check the CV. And many of these people, I will not give you names, just go to my book, but many of them still keep their CVs with such name as granted by Ruski Mir Foundation or supported by Valdai Discussion Club. It's a red flag. It's, but again, problem with Western academia that after Cold War is over, people decide, no, we need to, to be open to everybody. And this was a mistake. Putin and the KGB people in Russia never forget about this. For them, major goal is to punish the West for what they did to Soviets. And because, for Putin's interpretation, it's the West which targeted Russia all the time and destroyed Soviet Union. And unfortunately, in this situation now, Putin's winning because Western politicians still could not accept this position of confrontation, which constantly exists in Russian KGB mentality. This democratic openness of the West is played against the West by KGB, by GRU, infiltrating, recruiting. And the last moment, we forgot about money. Unfortunately, liberal West bureaucrats are not paid enough. And oligarchs in Russia and in Ukraine to some extent use this to bribe politicians, to bribe academics, to, look at this Alpha Foundation, stipends. Alpha Bank, it's pro-Putin, Petr Avin, Vekselberg, and other oligarchs from Soviet Union, from post-Soviet Russia, funded this bank. This bank created huge foundation for funding Western scholars from United States, Canada, United Kingdom, and Germany to come to Russia. And they supported their research. And when these Western scholars started going to Russia during the first war against Ukraine, during 2014, 2015, many of them took very good position, like Christopher Miller in Tufts University, being grantees of Alpha Foundation. And now FBI and the Department of State cut relations with this organization. But still, until 2023, Alpha Bank funded Western young scholars to go to Moscow, to go to Petersburg, to do their research. You can imagine what kind of ideas and perception these guys could bring to United States, to Germany, to United Kingdom. Of course, pro-Russian perspective. I check what, for example, this professor from Tufts University, Christopher Miller, he wrote a very good book about chips, war, and so on. But during the war against Ukraine, he never criticized, first war, criticized those people who gave him money, Alpha Fellowship money. Well, I just mentioned this one example. So poor scholars, poor politicians became target of GRU and KGB because now Putin and leaders of GRU use this situation to bribe politicians, to bribe bureaucrats, and bribe, of course, scholars. You should be honest in your research, but my book is not only for scholars, but also for administrators. Be careful, because, who knows what happened in 4 years? New administration would come. You can't serve, pro-Putin politicians all the time, because eventually a new administration would come, and you'll be responsible for betrayal of your national interests. I'm afraid that in Western democracy, we need to be very careful and very responsible. I already mentioned this case of American Democrats who use illiberal means for very good and noble liberal courses. I am part of this democratic liberal group, but now I understand the mistakes. You should be very careful, but at the same time, to protect your democracy, you need to be very responsible for whom you hire for any job. Check their background. And in this case, Western intelligence service, FBI, MI6 in England, other organizations of this kind need to be very vigilant and responsible, because Cold War is not over. And with Putin's regime, who knows what happened next. And both Europeans and Americans should be aware that we have very dangerous period of confrontation in front of us. And who started this? Putin's political regime, Russian Federation regime. And unfortunately, many Russians, including Russians who live in Canada, in the United States and Britain, still support Putin. And unfortunately, in my country, in the United States, after January 20th, they could open their hearts, show their preferences. And this is sad. So I gave you this a very sad picture, but I still believe in Western democracy. I'm now discovered a lot more interesting material about this GRU organization than KGB, because they were predecessor of GRU operations. And this will be good historical lesson how you should be careful with people from outside who are very cynical and ready for very nasty, very bad things. So I began this new chapter about this organization, this intelligence agency. I already started my conversation with you with this wonderful story of Zalman Litvin, who became quintessential figure, very intellectual. You know, he had a lot of positive features in the character. He was a patriot. He was a communist, but he did very nasty, very bad things in Canada and United States. But still, this war, intelligence war, is going on. And what happened in 2010, I started my book, as you remember, with this case of the exchange of spies, American spies and Russian spies in 2010, when American intelligence and FSB intelligence exchange their spies. It was another example of how even under Obama and later on, even under Trump, we still had this intelligence wars. And I still think that Republicans, despite all this pro-Putin sympathies, still need to protect interests, including strategic interests of their own country. So I think my next chapter, my next book, including GRU and KGB stories, will be a reminder to new administration, especially in the United States, about danger, and in Canada, of course, about danger of these guys. So be careful. Be careful playing these friendship games with Putin. So it's my, I am tired of very abstract themes because I thought about, small towns, trying to compare my Muncie, it's typical middle town of America, with my town in Cherkasy region of Ukraine. So at times it still will be my next project about culture consumption, rock and roll, and cultural identity. I still love this, but now as a citizen, I want to pay my due back to my Ukraine and to my American community, to remind them about danger of this friendship with Putin. I don't think that we need to concentrate on these, intellectual games of academia, playing these games of various concepts. And so now the situation is very simple. We are in this confrontation mood now. And to protect the West, protect liberal West, we need to be honest and be responsible for what we are writing and we discussing in our rooms. I hope that after this fellowship in Wilson Center, I will come to Ball State University, my place where I continue teaching, and I will continue to educate my students as citizens of free world, not as, stooges of totalitarian regime or authoritarian power. Thank you for your interest. Read my book. Yeah, thank you very much. Bye-bye.